My name's Monk Rowe, and I'm very pleased to have Pete Barbutti with me today. I really appreciate you taking your time out, and I have a lot of questions, and I'll try to start with a softball, and that is, you're still gigging, is that correct? You mentioned
Yeah,
for New Year's Eve, yeah.
I am. And I work a local club here once in a while, and of course I do all of the Las Vegas Jazz Society things. It's sort of the master ceremonies.
Yeah. When you do New Year's Eve, do you still get to play till midnight?
Uh, this year is strange. Usually that's what you do, and I don't like that. I mean, everybody hates working New Year's Eve. It's the same thing. One year at the Sahara Hotel, I was in the lounge. I was doing as a joke. I said, "Okay, we have a new thing here. What we do at midnight is you people come up here and finish the show, and we go out there and finish your drinks." And everybody laughed. And sure enough, 12 o'clock came, and the entire audience started to crawl across the bar to get on the stage. They took it literally.
Don't you just love the noisemakers?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right. Yeah. I still, I still one of the things burned in my mind is again, it was a New Year's Eve at the Sahara, and David Brenner, rest his soul, was a good guy. David was on stage in the showroom. And so I went back and, and stood in the wings and looked, and David was doing his act, and there were 1,000 people in the room. That's absolute capacity. And not one of them was watching the stage or listening to anything he was saying. They were all yelling and screaming. And he looked over at me, and he saw me there, and the two of us just broke up. It was like futile. There was simply no use.
Yeah. Sometimes reality is funnier than intended comedy, I
I think
guess.
so too. Yeah.
There's a
I have to
question.
tell you, you just said something that I flashed on. Excuse me for
Please
interrupting,
go
but
ahead.
uh, I had a local agent call me a couple of years ago, and he said I have an Indian casino down in Scottsdale, Arizona. He said they're really nice people, and it's an easy show. During the week, like on a Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday, you do one show, and then a couple on weekends, and they do nice crowds. And the guy who runs the place is a fan of yours, so he'll pick up all your expenses. And there's a brand new condo they give you to stay in, fully equipped. It was a nice thing. It was not too far to drive, and so I went down there, and I got there, and the band was a rock band, like a trio, and they had no idea what I was doing. So rather than go through a whole thing and lose my cool or anything, I just said, look, when I go like this or I say this, just play a B flat chord or something, and no use, fighting it. And so that's good enough, because most of it I did mostly, instead of the music, I did most of this straight stand up. And I found the opening act was an Elvis impersonator. And then there was a girl who did an impersonation of Stevie Nicks, who's a rock and roll singer. And then the next act was a group of 4 or 5 guys who did the Temptations. They, sang all their songs and so forth. And then I went on, and just before I'd let them close the show. And then they said on the weekends, we go out and stand in the casino behind the theater rope, and the people come by, and we thank them for coming in and shake their hand. I said, fine. So I went out there, and the people were coming by, and they were saying to me, you look just like them. And there was no response. There was no appropriate response. I mean, what am I going to say? I am him, or thank you very much.
Why? Thank you. My impersonations must have been a success.
Yeah, it was very strange. I've never had that happen before or
Yeah.
since.
It's funny you say that about, warm-up acts. I played in a rock and roll band for years, and one time we showed up in Rochester and we were warming up for a turtle race.
Oh, yeah.
Said, yeah, my career is really on the upswing here.
Yeah. Well, that's a spin-off of the old joke about the band who works New Year's Eve, and the club owner says, you guys are great. I'd like to have you again for New Year's Eve. And the drummer says, oh, that's great. Can I leave my drums here? Yeah.
Oh, there's a question that's been rattling around in my head since I knew we were going to meet. When you were getting ready to graduate from high school, Is it true that you turned down scholarship, music scholarship to Penn State?
Yeah. I had a chance to go on the road with a band, and that to me was infinitely more exciting. And although
What were your
I loved classical music. I was doing a lot of, in fact, I was playing with the Philharmonic when I was in high school, a percussionist.
Mhm.
And I was playing with the University of Scranton band, and I was playing with what they called the D. Malay band and the Shriner band. And then there was another fine orchestra in town called the Seta Parish band. And I was doing all of those playing percussion.
Did your parents question your choice to not take that scholarship?
Nah, no, they were supportive of just about anything, I wanted to do.
So
But
then what
I'm not sure it was the right or wrong choice or whatever. It doesn't matter as you look back. But
Mhm.
uh, I think sometimes maybe it would have been fun to do that. But then again, I don't know.
what were you like as a junior high student? What
Well, first of all, let me back up a little. I was incredibly shy as a kid. I mean, unbelievably. And in fact, I just remembered the other day when I needed new shoes, I was too shy to even go in the shoe store. So my sister, who was like 8 years older, she would go in the store and bring the shoes out and try them on me in the car. And I mean, it was almost like an emotional thing. And I was like that until uh, at age 9 or 10, they said you should take accordion lessons because everybody in our neighborhood, all the Italian kids played the accordion, all the Jewish kids played violin, and the girls played piano. Piano was considered feminine. Strangely enough, I went to see Arturo Sandoval at his invitation, which I was thrilled with because I love him. And he said the same thing in the Cuban culture. The piano was considered feminine. So he used to practice the piano, but he had to hide it because people would think he was gay if he played the piano. But everybody, my cousin Ray and I we both took accordion lessons, and we both had a beginner style accordion. And I studied with Professor Sebastianelli, and of course, the first 4 or 5 months was nothing but solfeggio, just singing the notes without playing the accordion. Then when I get home, I'd play the accordion. And that sort of gave me a reason to be different on stage or to go out in public. It sort of gave me some confidence. And then when I got into high school, uh, uh, we had a hot shot baseball team. We won the city championship, and so I was more into sports and running a track, and I had to take an elective subject. So I said, well, I'll take band. And the professor, the teacher there, is a guy named Gene Morris. He was in a Navy band, played trombone. He was a very hip guy, and he was a great arranger, and I mean everything. He was very today. And there was a piano player who was in the band too. His name was Charlie Coleman, and Charlie was way above his pay grade. Charlie was, I mean, we used to go down to the record store and play a Stan Kenton record. In the old days, we went in the booth and you could play. Well, you remember you play the. He'd play it 4 or 5 times, then he'd go home and he could score it for the band.
Oh.
He was in high school. So Charlie was a year older than me. Graduated a year before I did, uh, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I love music so very much. But having the accordion was it changed everything.
There's
Then,
something
of
about
course,
having a there's something about having an instrument or something between you and the audience or the people that are watching you that
yeah. Well,
seems
the first group I was with was called Teddy Volts and the Overtones. It was a real bebop group. It was accordion, bass, and guitar. And I remember, we'd start playing the tunes. We were doing all Lenny Tristano and Miles and all those tunes. And if the audience, like, if they started dancing or something, we changed the tempo. It was like an insult that they were enjoying us. We were like real artists. And so we got to the point where we had fewer and fewer gigs. And so they'd push me up front to announce the songs because I was the least inhibited of the group. And I got bored with saying, here's a song written by, Cole Porter. Uh, and so I'd start doing, here's a song written by Cole Porter and Clyde Beatty on a small fishing boat with Marie Dressler. I go through this big, long introduction, and the audience would turn around and they'd applaud for the introduction, then ignored the song. So, so I realized then that I got more and more confidence. Then when I started to work with a trio, first we went on the road, and then we worked with some old guy from Toronto who really tried to corrupt us in terms of music and comedy and everything. And then when that broke up, then I put together my dream group, with the guitar player that I went to high school with, a saxophone player who was, I think, a year and a half older, and a drummer that I had known since he was a little kid. And that group was called the Millionaires. And went on the road. We did really, really well. We were very successful. That was in the 50s. And we worked Jackson, Mississippi in the 50s, which I can tell you was an experiment on lifestyles, because when I went to school, there were a substantial amount of black kids in the school, even in the 50s in high school. And we got to Mississippi, and boy, we ran into some real problems. And
Like, can you be specific?
yeah, we first of all, we had to play Dixie to open every show, and then there were no black people allowed in there. There were no black people who allowed in the same stores we went in. Nobody at the lunch counters, nobody in the restaurants. They had to have their own little thing. And when we'd play certain kind of music, they'd come by and they'd say, "Stop playing that, the N-word music."
Mm-hmm.
And we had one incident where there was a young black kid worked in the restaurant. He swept up and carried things like a busboy, sort of. His name was Robert. And he liked us, and we hung out with him. And it was unusual for him to meet Northern people. I mean, there just weren't any around there. This in Jackson, Mississippi. And so the sax player with our car had a 49 Cadillac convertible. It's canary yellow. It was a block and a half long. It weighed about 6 tons. It was the most magnificent automobile with the fins. I mean, it was something to see. And on our day off, which was Sunday, Robert used to wash the car for Jimmy every day. And there was a sort of a symbolic thing with him that someday he might own a car like that. He'd wash it and he'd sit in it. And he was an adult. I mean, he was young, but he was an adult. And so on our day off, Jimmy threw Robert the keys, said, "Robert, take your girlfriend for a ride. Just don't drink when you're driving, take your girlfriend." Because we were going to hang out with some girl singers that were new down there. We had an apartment back there. We were going to party a little bit and play some cards and stuff. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, he's banging on the door and opened the door, and it was 2 very redneck cops. And they said, "We caught the nigger," pardon the expression, but that's the phrase they use, "who stole your car?" And we had no idea about the cultures. And I was the most articulate of the group, probably. So I started arguing with him, not knowing that in that day and age, they just shoot you and that's the end of it. And I started arguing. I said, "No, we loaned him the car, and I'll go down right now to the police station and sign an affidavit saying that we loaned him the car." And then they started to walk out, and then they came back and banged on the door again. And they say, we have to arrest you. We're charging you. And the charge was loaning a nigger a car.
Oh,
They made, it's a different, culturally, you can't understand it. It was very confusing. And yet the people we worked for were the loveliest people, the Taylor family. They were just very good to us. They were great people. But the whole thing was real tough for us.
can I ask you if this is pretty specific, but if
Yeah.
you were playing a gig down there and you played Tutti Frutti, if you announced it as Pat Boone instead of Little Richard, would that have been okay?
I think so. Yeah. The difference, it didn't seem so physical as it was in metaphysical. It's very strange.
Yeah.
I still have a bad taste
Hmm.
in my mouth from
When was
we
the
all
first?
we also went to see we're working a club in Shreveport, Louisiana, and it was called the Great American City. The sign said was we pulled in, and I saw in the newspaper Billy Eckstein and his band were going to appear there. And those are the old days when Billy wasn't a star yet, that he was just starting to make some noise in the business, had a couple hit records. And of course, on his band, Charlie Parker was on saxophone and Lester Young was on saxophone, and his piano player was Sarah Vaughan. I mean, and in those days, everybody kept track of that in that generation. We knew all the sidemen in every band and everything. And so I said to one of the black kids, porters in the club, I said, "Can you get us some tickets for this?" He said, "Well, yeah, that's in our part of town." I said, "Yeah, it's okay. We want to go see Billy Eckstein's band." So I said, the tickets were like $5 or something, $4. So I said, get one for each in the band, and here's another $8. You get two for you and your girlfriend or whatever. So we went there. We kept our uniforms on because we didn't know what the situation was, and we wore a saxophone strap. So we walked in there, and it was an unbelievable band. And like half hour later, I got this poke in my back and turned around, and it was a redneck white cop. I said, "What are you doing in here?" And they threw us out. And I stopped a police car. I mean, we, we had no idea, how dangerous it was because we were kids. We were, still in our teens. And I explained what happened, and the cop said, "Well, why did you go in there to see?" I said, "We saw Billy Eckstein." He said, "Well, what's Billy Eckstein doing in that club?" "Well, it's a black club. Billy Eckstein's black." I said, "Why did you want to see him?" It was beyond. There was no logic to it. It was,
I'm surprised that you're still here to talk to
yeah,
me
yeah,
today.
me too. In retrospect, we were kids. We had no, and we were raised in the North in Pennsylvania and Scranton, so we had no idea that this existed.
When you discovered at some point, I'm not sure if it would have been the accordion or the trumpet, but that you could play music that wasn't specifically written on a piece of paper, did that feeling eventually help your comedy routines?
Oh yeah, yeah, because comedy. I just talked to somebody that is a great entertainer. Uh, he's living back in the New England states now. And we talked about it a little bit. He said, "You came into my dressing room, we're working together, and you gave me this big lecture about jazz and comedy being the same thing." He says, "I still remember it. It was a long time ago." But yeah, I was a crusader for that because it's the same thing. You When you're playing jazz, it's obligatory that you stick to the same chord structure, and you can't add a beat whenever you want to. The specific number of beats, and what you do is within this framework, you take the liberties and you change the melody, but you're still obligated to stay within the same number of bars and whatever it is, the same chord structure. Comedy is the same thing. There has to be a believability. The infamous pig joke that I did on the Tonight Show. You start off with something that's really real and it's true. And you went to this guy's farm and he had the pig, and you go through this whole thing, but there has to be a reality to it. You can't say there was this elephant flying over. I mean, right away the people know there's nothing to that. So you have a reality to it, and then you ad lib it. You change the ending or change the
I heard
motif.
I heard you say something about seeing Shecky Green for the first time, and you were amazed that he had no structure or beginning or ending, and still he was hilarious.
I laughed so hard that I was ill. I had no idea, and it was sort of a revelation to me because I had been working in Chicago with the Millionaires, and we were there for about 6 months at one club. It was a really good gig, and older guys, comics would come in. They started to come in. Word was spreading. There's this comic working at the Cairo Club, and And so then the guy say, "You remind us of Shecky Green," and I never heard his name before because he wasn't a TV comic, you know. I said, "Who's that?" And they said, "Oh, he's out in Vegas. He's making big money. He's doing real good." I said, "Oh, great." Uh, and so I went to see Shecky. I heard all about him. He was a legend out here. I mean, truly a legend. Partly because of his wild antics. Shecky found out he was clinically depressed, and when he drank, he would he would do things unspeakable things, strange things. And so I went to see him, and he came out. He had no opening, and he just started going from there. And then he'd start his story about his it's about his mother's cooking. He grew up in Chicago, so all the Chicago guys knew. He'd start with his mother's cooking, and he'd say she would go to the butcher shop and she'd handle the chickens. We were so poor, and she'd say, "No, let me see that one." She'd handle about 5 or 6 chickens. Then she'd come home and put her hand in a pot of hot water. That's his chicken soup. And see, that's the joke there. But then he would take that and turn it inside out. He'd say, "The first time I went to a restaurant, I had chicken soup. It was so strong, I almost gagged. So I went in the kitchen to argue with the chef, and the chef had both his hands in the water." I mean, so instead of that joke, it's like a Virgil Parts cartoon or something.
It's
It's like
so,
off the wall.
yeah, it's so interesting because I never heard that before, but I could feel it coming, which made it even funnier.
Yeah, he's and then he would do this wonderful thing on opera on Madame Butterfly. He would do this whole thing about Puccini's genius and how he would do this and how he explains about the ensign on the set on the American ship who was in Japan, and he fell in love with this Japanese girl, Madame Butterfly, and she fell in love with him, and they lived together, and she became pregnant, and then they got orders that they had to ship out, and the ensign had this terrible. He was torn between them because he knew what would happen. Half-breed baby in Japan was shunned. He knew what he was leaving, and it was a terrible thing. And Shecky builds this thing was the music builds behind him. He says, and so Madam Butterfly is standing on top of the cliff, and she's watching the ship sail up, and she sings the most perfect aria ever written. He says, "Oh, you son of a bitch." It's just, but and then he would be halfway through that, and he'd go back to the part with his mother and the chicken, and he would have 4 or 5 things going all at once, and then he would finish them all. Bada bing, bada bing. I mean, it was something that you couldn't do on a computer today with all the memory there is. It was
It seems like eventually established bands, personalities start maybe to conflict, and I'm wondering if in the Millionaires, any of the other members started to resent the fact that you became in the spotlight.
well, no, no, there really wasn't. I regret, after the first group broke up, the guitar player got drafted.
Hmm.
Uh, the sax player and the drummer were both in the service and out, and I was in the Army Reserves, so I was exempt. But the guitar player, when he got drafted, and when you have a group like that where you're singing, we used to sing vocals like the Four Freshmen, and nothing's written on paper. We just learned everything, and we had these comedy routines. Because I found out when we started with the group, when we go to clubs, they'd say, "Do you play rock and roll?" And we said, "No, that's like blasphemy to us." And they
Why?
said,
Can
"Well, I
I
don't
ask?
know,
Yeah.
because it was so simple. First of all, the time is flat-footed. There's no life to the time, and secondly, it's 4 or 5 chords. They don't deal with augmented ninths and flatted fifths or anything like that, which jazz does. So it's a different part of music."
Well, what was your name a few tunes that were in the Millionaires repertoire?
Well, we did all standards. Cole Porter,
Okay.
Rogers and Hart. We did, Jerome Kern. We did all those kind of tunes, and then the jazz tunes.
Were
We did
people
this.
dancing to your music?
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. It was, and they were all very good players. Anyway, when this group broke up, we added another guitar player from the hometown, but he was a pain in the neck, and he was sort of a prima donna, and that didn't last long. So then we added two more guys, and it just never felt right. Till finally the group broke up, and I had a chance to reorganize it. So I got a trombone player from Scranton, Tony Ardito. He's a great player, and a guitar player from Coatesville, Pennsylvania, that we had never heard before, but he had a good name, and a drummer from Baltimore named Joey Preston. His real name was Joey Prestiani. But Joey was a child protege. When he was 14, he was playing with the Kenton Band. I mean, he was a brilliant, brilliant player. He did a lot of movies. He wore short pants when he was like 10 or 11 because he was small and got away with it. And this group came out here, and we were killing out here in Vegas. And then the guitar player, who was a lot older than us, he decided he didn't want to travel anymore. So he stayed with one of the show bands, and then we just worked as a trio without him. And we added a local piano player. We were at the Thunderbird Hotel for a long time. We were sort of like the house group in the lounge there. And one of the owners of the Thunderbird was very fond of us. He was a guy who owned a club in Wichita many years ago, and he bought into the Thunderbird but couldn't be on the license because he had a felony conviction. But he at his club in Wichita, Charlie Parker used to work there, and he was always getting in trouble because he'd go in the boiler room and smoke a joint, and it would get into the ventilator. People would smell this weird smell. So Lee Deer was the man's name. I can tell you, since passed away. He was a dear man. And he said to Charlie Parker, "You got to get out of here, go to New York." He later saved the life of maybe the best guitar player who ever lived, Joe Pass, who was a terrible user of hard drugs. And he took Joe Pass physically by the hand, took him out to the airport in Vegas, put him on a plane to Los Angeles, got in touch with Synanon, and told the flight attendant he's not to leave the plane until Synanon comes on the plane. This is the old days before security, and gets him and takes him. And anyway, Joe Pass went into Synanon, straightened his life out, and disappeared for a couple of years. And then I had the good fortune to be traveling with Nat King Cole at the time, and Nat said, "You got to hear this guitar player." And he put this record on. He says, "Wow, who was that?" He said, "Some guy named Joe Pass." I said, "Joe Pass." But
Nice.
yeah, but anyway, this guy Lee Deer said, "Look, why don't you put together the group that you want, and I'll sign the contract. You can stay here." So I got Mike Woodford on piano, who's internationally known jazz player, a bass player from Lake Tahoe named Chuck Delora, who's a great player, Richie Madison, who's like a great, great jazz educator. He was at North Texas State, and then he went to North Florida and won every award there. And it was, and we got a girl singer who was married to Maynard Ferguson years ago, a girl named Kay Brown. So we had three horns, three rhythm, and a girl singer. And Richie and I put our heads together and wrote. Richie especially was way above me, man. He wrote unbelievable stuff. And we were together like 3 months, and Capitol Records signed us to a recording deal. The group was really strong. And then one night we were working on Lake Tahoe, and our manager showed up and said, "I'm sorry about the problems." So what problems? He said, "Well, this guy said this guy," and like overnight, the group, everybody left. And I had signed for all the uniforms and the singers' gowns and everything. So everybody took off, and I was living in a rented house in Vegas with three kids, and my wife was pregnant with the fourth, had no income. So it was a real bad time. And then I went to see Frank Ross from the Mary Kay Trio. They were like big stars in Vegas. I went to see Frank Ross, and Frank said, "You got to go on your own. You shouldn't be with the group." And he says, "I'm going to call an agent. He's going to call you." So this agent called me and said, "I have a gig for you in Spokane, Washington." I never heard of Spokane. I heard of Seattle, but I never heard of Spokane. He said it's some kind of steakhouse or something called the Stockyards Inn in Spokane, and it doesn't pay much. But I said, "Okay," but I said George Burke was the agent's name. Forgive me for remembering these names. This is like 60 years ago, and I, for some reason, it popped into my head. But George Burke set it up, and it was my first single ever.
Oh,
And so I was terrified. And I said, George, I'm ashamed to tell you, I don't have the money to get to Spokane,
mm.
and I don't have a car. So he said, you take the bus. I said, okay, but it takes like a day and a half to get there on the bus. Stopped everywhere, Fresno and Elko and everywhere. And so George Burns said, okay, I'll send you a money order. This is before you could transfer money. And so I said, okay, but I need it by whatever, like Thursday, if I'm going to get to Spokane for Saturday. He said, oh, don't worry about it. Anyway, it didn't get there.
Oh.
And I called him and said, look, I never got the money. The bus is leaving in 5 minutes and I can't get on it. And George just washed his hands of everything. Look, this is to another agent in Spokane, a guy named John Powell. He lives up there, and I don't just call him. So I called John Powell, and John said, hey, they're advertising you and everything direct from Las Vegas. So I said, so he says, I'll send you I'll send you an airline ticket. You could wire it in those days. So he sent me an airline ticket, and the pay was $300 a week, and the airline ticket was $309. So before I got on the plane, I was out $9. Anyway, I got the ticket. And I flew to Spokane, and I had on one of the suits from the band, and a very hip top coat and a goatee. And John Powell looked at me, and I looked like an alien. I mean, Spokane is really conservative, right wing, And he looked at me and he said, this isn't a jazz gig, I said, well, I know, John, I'll do the best I can. So he drove out. It was February and it was pouring rain. And we drove out. My youngest son was just born a few weeks before this. So we drove out to the club, and there was a big sign on the club. It said direct from Las Vegas, and he misspelled Las Vegas. He had LOS. And then I realized why it's called the Stockyards Inn. It was in the middle of the stockyards. So we had to walk on planks across the steer poop to get to the club. And the guy's name who owned it was his dad was very rich, and this guy wanted to have a club. So his dad said, here's some money. His name was Rocky Rothrock. And I went in there, and the room was okay. It was a rectangular room of decent size. And he said, well, what do you need? I said, well, the best thing would be a piano bar. Well, you mention a piano bar to most people today, they sort of know what you're talking about. But Rocky, from another planet somehow. And he said, what's that? I said, well, it's like you got a bar. The piano is like a bar, and the people can sit and talk to you and drink while you're playing requests. And he said, well, that's a good idea. I got you covered. So I went into work that night, and he had an old upright piano up against the wall, and he built a bar around the back of me. So the people were looking at the back of my head, and the piano was almost unplayable. And so I did the best I could. And then after a couple of nights, more and more people started to come into the bar. And I said, Rocky, it'd help if there was a light in the corner of that room. He said, okay. So I went in the next night, and I'm not exaggerating. He had a cord hanging down from the ceiling and a 100-watt bulb with like a pool room shade over. And I'd go, turn on the light, and everybody go, oh, it was dark in the room. And then I said, Rocky, with this piano like this, I can't see the people. So the next invention of his was on top of the piano, he mounted a mirror from a dresser, and it would swivel. And he gave me a dowel so I could reach up and move the mirror. And my final request was if I could get a microphone. He said, well, we got a sound system in the whole building. He says, that's no big deal. I'll get you a microphone. So he got me one of those little microphones like Broderick Crawford on Highway Patrol. This Broderick Crawford where you would squeeze the thing and talk into it. And I'd set it on the edge of the piano, just as where the keyboard ends. I'd set it there. And then I'd pick it up and I'd turn to the audience. And I was doing jokes, and I was doing local stuff, and people started to come in, and the place was getting crowded and everything. And then the crowning blow was, I was right in the middle of a story one night, and over the same speakers that my voice is emanating, I hear, Johnson, party of 6, 2 chicken fried steaks, two fried chicken. It was like it was hooked up to the
Yeah.
cook and everything. And so I start yelling at this guy who was the manager. His name was Mr. McCluskey. And even his son called him Mr. McCluskey. He was that revered as a restaurant manager in Spokane. So I deleted the Mr. It was blasphemy. I called him McCluskey. And then, boy, people were going, oh my God, he called him McCluskey. It was like a big sin. Anyway, I carried on
You've
and
come a long way, baby.
oh yeah. And it was, I mean, I literally used to go in the men's room in between shows. I'd be in tears,
Yeah.
thinking I just left this killer group, I had these big arrangements and here I am working this gump.
What was the phone calls? What were the phone calls to home like?
Well, it was tough, it was tough. I talked to the kids. The other three kids were old enough to talk to me, and my old lady, and my youngest son was just a baby at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It was very difficult. And then this manager, this John Powell, at least now I was making 300 a week. I could send 250 home through Western Union, so she could pay the rent and buy some food. And it was really just stretching it out. And then John Powell said, "Hey, you're packing the room. I'm going to ask for more money." And then he came to me, said, "Rocky said he can't afford to pay any more money. So I got a club across town you can work called the Plantation. And the guy likes you. He's been in to see you. Perry Williams is his name." I said, "Great." So I went to the club. He says, "Over there, you're going to have a band behind you." I said, "Whoa, I'm back in showbiz." So I went there, and the band consisted of an organ player named Tony Pasco. No matter what he played, it sounded like a roller rink, that sound. So we rehearsed a little bit with Tony, and the rest of the band was a drummer. So it was an organ and drums. And the drummer was the owner of the club, Perry Williams, who played drums once in a while. And so opening night, as bad as it was still better than where I was. And so I was thanking God for that. And I went out and I was singing some song to open, Lady as a Tramp or something to open the show. And halfway through, the drums stopped. Well, I'm in showbiz. I'm not going to turn around and say, what happened to the drummer? So I just keep singing. Out of the corner of my eye, I see my drummer, who's the club owner, walking down the aisle. The front picks up two menus, a party of two. He seated people. My drummer was seating people during the show. It was like, anyway.
Somehow that seems like if I can get through this, man, I can do pretty much anything.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah. And my other question was when I've watched some of your shows on video, like most comedians, the timing and the space, the silence, followed by the punchline is so much a part of the success. And was that something you learned over the years?
Yeah, and that's the application of the music to the, it's so important to the the tempo and rhythm, and people will laugh at something that isn't even funny if the tempo and the rhythm is right.
I had a interesting coincidence that I saw a Marx Brothers movie between the time that we had first spoken, and I wonder if they were an influence on you.
Yeah, I love the Marx Brothers and the Ritz Brothers.
Mm-hmm.
I had the good fortune to meet Harry Ritz before he passed away. He had lived here in Vegas, and he was in a rest home of sorts. And Joe Delaney, who is a newspaper guy, the only real decent critic we've ever had here, Joe called me and said, "Harry Ritz is in a home. Do you want to go by?" And so we went by and spent a couple afternoons with him, and he still was sharp. He would forget things, but he still was funny. And
well, mutual friend told me to ask you about Chico Marx.
Yeah, he was special. He was special, and they were all. I mean, Harpo, Chico, they were all incredibly talented, and they were just funny. They got it somehow.
Yeah.
And they're I think the criteria for any art form is its longevity. I mean, you don't see people look at the Mona Lisa and say, you should have had more blue. Or looking at the Sistine Chapel and say, no, you should have used more reds. I mean, 500 years later, you look at that painting and it still takes your breath away. So the real criteria for art is its longevity, and the Marx Brothers are still funny today when you watch them. Abbott and Costello are still funny today. The routines they developed in the burlesque and in vaudeville, their movies were just an extension of Who's On First. The two characters created by them in that one routine. And it took years to create that routine. Unfortunately, today, that part of the puzzle, it no longer exists, where there used to be theaters where you could work, a week in Wilkes-Barre, then a week in Philadelphia, a week in Pittsburgh, a week in Allentown, a week in Altoona, then you'd hit Ohio, and and then after that, there were supper clubs, and that's where that was my background, working supper clubs.
So you must have had a lot of, if you were on the road or doing your solo act, you had a lot of time to think
Yeah,
about what am I going to do tonight?
yeah.
Did you uh, find a way to rehearse your acts, like in front of a mirror or
No,
something?
I never did that, and I never planned anything either. I would go out and check the audience out. The first couple of minutes you learn to do that. You get some kind of vibe from them, and you see where you can go, how far you can go in this direction, being off the wall, or how conventional you have to be in this direction. So you can analyze them very quickly like that, parse them, and get some idea of where they're at, and then you can work from that frame of mind. But
Hmm.
I never, even the band, I never tell the band. I just tell them we're going to open with that one tune. I would do a song and to open the show, and like you put a comedy thing in the middle of it or something. And I tell them we'll open with this, and that was all I ever told them. And I always work with bebop guys because they understood where I was going without me. I never had to turn around and say, I'm going to do Oklahoma, but I'm going to add extra beats. There's nothing. I would just say, here's the score from Oklahoma, and I'd say Oklahoma, and I put extra beats in, and the drummer would just follow along, and the piano player would know. So with the beboppers, duck soup. That's why I always used the real hip guys. I didn't have to rehearse them much at all.
Yeah, improvising was not a foreign word to them.
Yeah, so they know where you go, and they understood too. If I was doing something, if I would say a certain thing, they knew that they should boo me, or they should say yeah, or they should say right on, be real hip or something. They understood. They got that. That's why I always loved the Tonight Show so much, because all they're all bebop guys on that band, and they understood. I never had to say to them, sometimes I'd go out and I'd be talking to the audience, telling a story. You know, I'd say this guy was a terrible man, and he actually killed this woman, strangled her in a parking lot. And then I'd say to the audience, excuse me. And I'd go over to the band and I'd say, it's not like you guys have so much to do. I'm out there by myself and you're just sitting here. So a little, like, if I say the lady got killed, would it hurt you guys to go like, oh, and then for the rest of the routine, you have all this, and then the audience is doing it too. They're all like, and it makes it so stupid, but it's really funny.
Did you ever think about a routine, for instance, your fourth trumpet playing,
Yeah.
and determine in your head, make a decision, this is not too inside for the
Well,
audience?
you know what happened? I analyzed that for a long time because first of all, I used to play with those bands.
You knew
So
what it was
there's
like. Yeah.
yeah, there's a sense of reality, and you can't fool musicians when you do that. They know that when you're doing that routine, oh, he knows he was there. They get it right, the little inside things.
Yeah.
But I think people get that because when you graduate from high school, the class always has to sing a song. There's a graduation day. The whole class is there, and the vocal teacher, the head of the drama department, whomever that is, they conduct this song, and it's usually a patriotic song or something, or "You'll Never Walk Alone," or one of those things, you know. And there's a solo part, and the chick who gets the solo part is a chick that nobody ever likes. She's a real prima donna, you know. And so the rest of us end up singing "As You Walk Through the Storm and the Sun is High." Ooh, the rest of us get to do that, and so we always carry that through the rest of our life. That we were in the background, and this chick that we hated got to sing the lead, you know. So that I think that's where the people sort of get that.
Yeah, they've all experienced it in some fashion.
Yeah,
Yeah. As time went by, did you find that filling a half an hour or whatever got easier? I shouldn't talk about myself, but I wanted to tell you that I was in a rock band for a while, and somehow I ended up doing a 10-minute opening comedy routine.
yeah,
And I called myself Billy Schechter. And I found it was the hardest thing I've ever done.
yeah.
It
It's
was only
tough.
10 minutes, and I would put cue cards on the floor to
Yeah.
look down if I couldn't think of what to talk about.
Well,
But
I'm going to tell you a perfect analogy of that. Uh, for some reason, I've done a couple of shows with George Plimpton, the author. And you know, George Plimpton, before he writes, he does it. He played football with the Chicago Bears, and he got busted up bad. Then he did a trapeze thing and threw his back out, but he does everything before he writes it. And George came to Vegas to do a comedy routine at Caesar's Palace. And he worked with Milton Berle and Alan King and Cosby. They said to him, would do this, light a cigarette when you do this, put your hand in your pocket. They told him what to do. And one night at Caesar's Palace, I forget who was headlining, but they announced a special treat today. We have a new comic, and they didn't use his right name. And so George Plimpton went out on stage and he did like 8 minutes. And George Plimpton, we're talking about it on Merv's show. And George Plimpton said, Merv, he says, of all the things I've ever done, you know, when I threw my back out, he said, you know, how incredibly painful that is. And when I broke my collarbones, he says, none of those things came close to the pain that I suffered those 8 minutes on stage with the entire audience looking at me, and they hated me. He said it really is the worst death I've ever suffered in my life.
did you ever suffer the death like that?
Yeah, sometimes it happens. You
Yeah.
know, Al Jolson was nuts when he said no such thing as a bad audience. You get audiences. Somebody did a test many, many years ago, maybe 75 years ago or something, in New York City, where they had every entity that had entertainment call in to a certain phone bank and rate the audiences after each show. And they kept records. And the funny part was, except for a real rare exception, the funny part was when the show at the Copacabana was, the audience was bad, the audience was bad at the Latin Quarter. And when there's some atmospheric, who knows, vibes, news, something in the news that day that changes your perspective. But yeah, you get a bad audience. But you know, it's happened to all of us. Even Shecky talks about it. You know, when he was the king of the kings, he said, I was really bombed here, bombed there. And, you know, you have the, so you learn that. And sometimes you're in a bad situation. You know, they booked me at the Steel Pier in Atlantic City, opening for Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Well, you know, that audience, they were all kids who wanted to see Smokey Robinson. They were yelling and screaming, you know, and you can't do it. My
What's a,
act.
what's a fourth trumpet?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So what does that mean? You know, so it's just a bad booking.
Yeah. Um, when you knew that you were recording for an LP, did you change anything in your routine because the physical, visual part of it wasn't going to be there?
Yeah. No, I just did it. You know, uh, My theory was always different. In fact, I had a long talk with Johnny Carson, rest his soul. Uh, One night I was talking to him, and he says, "You get it. You do the right thing." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You do what I've always done." He says, "I don't do anything I do for the television audience. I do it for the audience there, the 500 people." And that's what I always did. I worked to the 500 people there and let the director, let him translate that to the picture on the tube. That's not my job. That's his, but I just worked for whomever was in the room beside me. And that's what I did with the albums. And then they do some editing, but they never required much because I never did any blue
Yeah.
material.
Did you fall afoul of Johnny Carson for a number of years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did the show in New York, the Tonight Show when it was
Yeah.
in New York. That was a long time ago.
Rich Henderson was on that.
Skitch Henderson's
Yeah.
band, yeah. Uh, and Mel Torme, I think I'm almost certain it was Mel, was on the show. And Carson is a big jazz lover, and so Mel Torme was a god to him. And Mel Torme was on before me, and then they told me, "This is your first shot, so you don't go to the panel. Do your stand up and walk out." So I did something very hip. Maybe it was the fourth trumpet. I don't know what I did, but Carson actually came and got me physically and took me to the panel. Everybody's going, "Oh man, you are made. He's never done that before." And we spent a whole segment there, and then he said, "Stick around." We came back for the next segment, and he was telling me short stories, and I was telling him some. And Mel Torme started to laugh while Carson was telling a story. And Mel didn't mean anything personally by it, but he said, "I'm so sorry, John. I didn't mean to stop your story, but I can't stop laughing at that thing Pete did." And Carson turned like right now. It was like, "How dare you try to be hipper than me?" And he ended the segment there. And it was 14 years. I was not allowed on the Tonight Show. And Peter LaSalle, who was the producer, is my biggest fan in the entire world. And yet he would call every once in a while and say, "I'm so sorry I mentioned your name to Johnny," and he threw a book on the floor and whatever it is. And then Carson started to take time off, and they were having guest hosts, and John Davidson was the first one. I had worked with John before, we were good buddies. And John asked me on, and so I talked to Peter. I said, "Is it okay? I don't want to get you in trouble here because you're my friend." He said, "No, as long as Carson's not here." So I started to do it with all the guest hosts. And then one day they called me, and I'd done it like 50 times or something. And one day they called me and said, "Can you do it Friday?" And I said, "Yeah, that's fine." And they asked who's on, because if you have a lot of singers, I'll do straight stand up. If you have a lot of talkers, I'll do something more musical, because the show is good, then I'm good. You want the show to be good. The show's the thing. That's the motto. And so I said, he told me who's on. They said, "Who's hosting?" He said, "Johnny." I said, "Oh no, I'm on the list. I don't do it with Johnny." And the guy said, "Ooh, sorry, I didn't know. I'll call you next week." I said, "Okay." Then he called right back and he said, "I just mentioned your name to Carson." He said, "Great."
Oh,
So
wow.
I went there. I didn't apologize. He didn't apologize. And we started this symbiotic relationship
Mhm.
where I would barge into his private makeup room when he was getting makeup and tell him the latest dirty joke, or he'd tell me the latest joke. And we had this thing. And I was one of the very few acts to work that show when they'd say, "What are you going to do?" The associate producers say, "What are you going to do?" And I always tell them, "I'm going to do the poodle joke. I'm going to do the rabbit joke." And they say, "You always say that. You never do that joke." I said, "Well, I'm going to do it this time." And they would never ask me to do the joke. Every other comic, you had to do the routine
Mm.
in an office to somebody so they could make sure the continuity. They could make sure they didn't have to censor something.
Is there a rabbit joke?
I don't know. I would just make it fix it. And then they'd say, "How much time are you going to do?" And I always say 6 minutes. They say, "You never do 6 minutes. You always go over." I said, "Well, this time I'm going to," they never complain. And once in a while, when they'd say to me, "Look, we're short of time. That last segment ran really long with so-and-so's actor or some politician or something. So we don't know how much time. You want to just tell one joke, or you want to just go to the panel?" I said, "Look, let me just tell one joke." And I would start this joke. And I would start explaining the carpeting that was on the floor of the club. It was a high-low carpeting, and then I would ask people, like, say, Doc, you remember that guy? And Doc, everybody would get hip to what was going on, and they would start doing this real long answer to. I'd say to Ed McMahon. Incidentally, Ed and I were, it was a strange relationship. Ed McMahon hated me more than any person in the world. Hated me. I think it was because Carson didn't like me. He's sort of like, plugged into Carson so long. But Ed told the Joe Delaney, the newspaper guy here in town, Ed was sitting at the pool and Joe came by and they were good friends. And Ed went on for 30 minutes about how he hates me and he couldn't believe that Joe Delaney was writing good things about me. And he just, and then, so instead of accosting Ed, I started to really bug him. I'd do routines. And in the middle, I'd say, like the one that plane that Ed used to fly. Ed, you're a pilot, weren't you? I would bring him into, and he would, grudgingly start by saying, yeah. And then he had his secretary and her fiance, they were coming to Vegas to get married. And Ed had a plane chartered because he was working at the Frontier Hotel. He got them a hotel room, which was comped. And he got them dinner in there, which is comped, big deal. And then he brought on the plane a Laughing Cow cheese and a bottle of some real cheap wine, not Thunderbird, but something really cheap. And the pilot was a friend of mine, George Hernandez. Had a commercial license, but he was a piano player and entertainer. And George came to me and said, hey, he says, did you drive down? I said, no, I flew down. He says, why don't you fly back? Ed's got a plane chartered, the twin engine, Queen Anne, the Queen. It's a beautiful plane. He says, come on back with us. I said, hey, Ed, I don't get along with it. He says, just sit in the back. Ed won't know you're there. So anyway, I did. I went out and I sat way in the back, and Ed got on the plane with his secretary, and he said, well, you're going to enjoy your trip to Vegas. I got you seats at this and seats at, which didn't cost Ed anything, Mm-hmm. He's going on. And halfway there, George Hernandez leaned out. There's no door to the cockpit. And he says, hey, Pete, you remember the thing? And I said, yeah. And they didn't know I was sitting back there. So they all turned around. They saw me and they say, hey, we didn't know you were back there. I said, well, that's okay. Congratulations on your wedding. And I wish you healthy and good luck. He said, thank you. And then the chick said, wait a minute, you're that guy who plays the piano with his nose. I said, yeah, I'm afraid so. The two of them left Ed and came back and talked to me. And he was just, burning, man. So that didn't help at all. But I kept doing this thing on him, the biblical heap coals of kindness upon your enemy, whatever. Kept doing that. And then finally, like Ed started to take me in the audience, introduced me to friends of his. We got to be really weird. And Carson and I got like really close. They'd say when he comes in to do the show, he's flanked with Ed McMahon's already there doing the warm-up. He's flanked by Peter the Sally, Ed DeCordova, and a security guard, Fred DeCordova. He said, so don't approach, no one's to approach. Anyway, Carson would lead them and come over to me and tell me the latest joke or something. And we'd always have this inside thing. I don't know what the deal was, but
you were a magnet.
Yeah, there was something that he found interesting that we became really, really close.
Of course, he had prompters, either teleprompters or
yeah,
the things on the big cards or whatever.
Yeah, cue cards they used for a while.
Did you ever use cue cards?
No.
I'm not surprised.
No. Well, now on the first shows I did, the Steve Allen show, if they asked me to do the sketches, they didn't have teleprompters yet. They had cue cards. And what they would do is in rehearsal, Steve Allen would forbid the use of the punchlines at rehearsals. So you do the joke, hey, Fred, what time do you leave for the bank? I'm leaving for the bank, but I have to go somewhere first. Where do you have to go? Rabba Zaba Zaba. You weren't allowed to read the punchlines. So when you did it that night on camera, it was fresh for the first time you were hearing it.
Oh.
It's interesting. It was a dangerous thing, but
yeah, he was quite. You described him as a very analytical and had.
Well, he was about everything.
Yeah.
everything. Steve had to know the reason why everything worked. He told me once he burned his hand or his finger or something, and somebody was driving him down to the clinic, and he held his finger out the window, and the rushing air soothed the pain. And he started this whole thing where he wanted to find out why rushing air is like that. And I did a show in Vancouver called The Next Line. The producer's a good friend of mine, and it was a great premise. It was a game show. It was fun, and he wanted to do some music in it. So he said, "Can we find enough?" We're doing 65 shows. He said, "Can we find 65 songs?" And the premise was they'd show an old movie, and then they'd freeze frame, and the celebrities would come up with the next line. One of them had the right one, and the other ones had wrong ones, and the contestants would have to guess who had the right. So with the music, it was somebody'd sing, and he says, "Can we find enough songs that are public domain so I don't have to pay ASCAP for all these songs?" So I said, "I don't know." So I started, and I said, "Wait a minute, I've written a few songs. Let me see how many songs I can write." So I started writing words and music. I started, and I sort of sequestered myself, and I actually wrote 65 songs, and we did them on the show, and it was very successful. And I thought, I'm going to write to the Guinness people, because I don't know if anybody's ever written 65 songs in like 6 weeks period. And then I read somewhere Steve Allen wrote like 25,000 songs or something. And I said, that's it. I give up, man. He was incredibly prolific. He was,
Yeah. I remember him saying something like he sat in front of a picture window and did that as people were watching or some such thing.
yeah, he did one called Occupado on airplanes. If you were getting up to go to the restroom or something, they had a seat, a little plastic card that said occupied. You put it on your seat. On the reverse side, it was in Spanish for non-English speaking people. It said occupado. And he found that word. So he wrote a Latin tune, a samba, not a samba, but a rumba called occupado. It
Yeah.
was, I mean, if you look over there, he would write some. But
Did you
Steve
ever
wanted to
want
know.
did you ever want to play like a music only gig and find that your reputation as a comedian got in the way of that?
Yeah, yeah, that happened. I was getting my kicks. I go out to the union building when the musicians union here was so strong. They had the building off Tropicana, and I'd go out there and play with the rehearsal bands, kicks bands. And
Mhm.
you go out and you could just play and play and play, and it would go on for hours. So that was okay. But if I try to do it in public, somebody can come up and say, "You're going to play with your nose, aren't you?" They do something like that. So,
Yeah, yeah. A few years ago, I saw a pretty well-known comedian, and I don't think he'd been on stage for 5 minutes when he'd used most of the profanity that George
yeah,
Carlin had written about.
yeah,
And I wonder how you feel about that.
yeah. I don't. It bothers me. In fact, it bothers Shecky Green. Shecky said to me one night, he says, "I've walked out on several comics. They were too dirty for me." And we all, know all those words. And, when we're in totally male company or we're with other entertainers, we tell jokes that are really, obscene, but not in public. That's a different thing. I couldn't do that.
Hmm. You familiar with the Bill Crow Jazz Anecdotes book?
No, I'm not.
Okay, well, he gathered all kinds of wonderful stories from jazz musicians, and I wanted to see if checking his veracity that he wrote that you were doing a show one time and you were going to do Tenderly on the Broom, and you couldn't, no one could find a broom, and finally someone came up with a vacuum cleaner.
Yeah, I called it a fender broom.
No, I don't play no Fender broom.
Yeah,
Okay, well, good. He was truthful then.
yeah. Yeah, that happened at Lake Tahoe. I was working there, great group behind me too, all beboppers, in a showroom at Harvey's Hotel. Yeah, Will Osborne, the old band leader, was the entertainment director. He's a great guy. And it was Christmas time. And what happened was one night it started to snow. We get up the next morning and the snow was over the cars, Lake Tahoe. I was 5 feet is not bizarre up. And so all the roads were closed because Tahoe's at the top of this real winding, no easy way up there. And so everything was closed. There were no tourists in yet for the holidays. And so I walked out on stage for the first show, and there were like 12 people in the room. Then there were dealers, you know, 21 dealers, craps dealers. They just came in because nobody was in the casino. And so it was funny. And Will Osborne, was joking. See, they finally found out what kind of an act you have. This is the best crap. We joked around. And for the second show, he said, if you want to go home, I said, now we're here, we'll do a second show. And so the curtain opened and the room was packed with all employees and they were all reading a newspaper.
Was that a setup?
Yeah.
They set you up?
Yeah. I mean, we laughed, man. And so then I wasn't going to do my regular show. So I played a song on the piano, I did a song on the trumpet. I did a song on the accordion. I used to play Fender bass too. I did a song on the bass. And then he said, well, that's about it. And Will Osborne threw a broom out. He said, here, play this. And I picked it up. I swear it was like I had been doing it for a year. I said, okay, I'd like to play a ballad tenderly. And they backed me up and they understood when I doubled the time, the band knew it was like I've been doing it for years. I had the mutes from the trumpet, so I put a mute in the broom and played it real soft. I used the plunger going.
That whole thing was spontaneous?
Yeah, it just happened one night. I have incidentally, I have a big plaque from the American Academy of Recording Sciences for being the world's best broomist. It's an Emmy, or a Grammy. Yeah.
Oh. Did you write when you had a band accompaniment, did you write those charts or did you hire?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I've written some stuff for college bands too. I probably would have difficulty writing it today, but at the time I was doing it a lot, and I had help from people. Certain people would say, if you're going to voice this, do this way or something, and good people.
Nice.
In fact, when I was in high school, I for my junior year, my sophomore year, I went right in with the advanced band, and for my junior year, I was first chair all-state Pennsylvania for the conference they have where you go to the Harrisburg or someplace and have, work with a big time director. And same thing in my senior year. But for my senior year, I wrote the thing for our band to play drum solo. Not a set of drums, just snare drum, different tricks in it. But I wrote it for the band, and it was okay.
And you had score paper, and you were doing it with the.
Well, I never really worked from a score. I'd start with an idea, I'd write like the trumpets first, and then the trombones, and then the saxes, and then sometimes I'd have to go back and say, wait a minute, this has to be like this. So, but I'm not I'm not in the same class as Don Costa, those guys who would just be on an airplane and take a paper and write a chart for Sinatra that would be swinging like crazy, without any score.
I can see the stewardess. Would you like some coffee?
Yeah,
don't interrupt me. I'm writing.
Yeah, frequently I would carry manuscript and write a chart on a plane on the way to a gig. Something I thought of that I wanted to do. Wanted to do in the show.
Did you have any trumpet heroes growing up?
Well, I think the same ones everybody did. Harry James, Louis Armstrong, of course. Harry James. Incidentally, I did a show with Louis Armstrong called Hollywood Palace in Hollywood, obviously. And I hung out with Louis Armstrong for 3 days, and he was the most amazing human being. He was he told me stories too. I mean, boy, he was the best. And then Harry James took it to the next level. Harry lived here in Vegas, so I got to see him, frequently at different benefits and things.
What
But
about
then I got close to, Buddy Childers, who played lead on the Kenton Band, and I worked with Maynard, did a bunch of concerts with him, and Doc, of course, who was, in a league by himself.
what about Rafael Mendez?
Yeah, I have to tell you, in fact, one of the great stories of my life. I'm working a club in Seattle. This is right after Spokane. It was the year of the World's Fair in 1962. I have a great trio behind me, and I'm working this little club called Rossellini's 410. It was a very hip place, and it was packed every night. I'm working it, and somebody sends up a note that says Rafael Mendez is in the audience. And I said, well, it's somebody named Rafael Mendez, but obviously it's not the Rafael Mendez. He's the greatest classical trumpet player that ever lived. And from the back of the room, I hear, yeah, he's here. I said, what's he doing here? He said, he's conducting the orchestra out at the fairgrounds for the big show, the Roy Rogers show. It was a big orchestra, and Rafael Mendez was doing a song, and I said, my God, Rafael Mendez is in the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, the greatest trumpetist who's ever lived. And some drunk yelled, have him sit in. And with that, I chastised this drunk, saying, sir, you don't understand. Rafael Mendez is above what we're all doing or thinking here. He is on a level. And Rafael Mendez said, yeah, I don't mind. He gets up, he takes my old beat up trumpet. He turns to the trio, he says, Tico, Tico in A minor. He does double, triple tonguing. And then he does a chorus of the circular breathing where he never breathes. And then he goes and he ends it on a double A above high C, which is like a B on trumpet, almost a double C. Then he hands me the trumpet and gets off the stage. Well, I stand there looking at the trumpet and the laugh starts. And I keep looking at it and I look up at him and the laugh gets bigger. And I look at the band and they all go like this and the laugh gets bigger, And I look at the trumpet again, examine it, and the laugh just kept getting bigger and bigger. It's like, what the hell am I going to do with this thing? There's nothing left. Every note in the world has been played. And finally I put the trumpet down and I got a round of applause, like it was the longest laugh I've ever had in my life. But and then I took the kids out the tree because the young was too little. I took the kids out. I had them fly up to Seattle because I was there for a long time, and my wife and the kids. And I took them out because Rafael Mendez said, "Come on." His Roy Rogers' manager, Art Rush, was his manager for like 30 years. Never had a contract. Never had an argument. He was a wonderful, kind man. Art Rush said, "Bring your family out to see Roy Rogers in the show." Okay. So I took him out and I met Art Rush there and he gave me a nice hug. And these are my three kids. He said, I bet the kids would like to ride on Trigger. He brought Trigger out, who was old at the time, and put the kids on Trigger and they rode around a little bit. And I said, wow, this is really something, I mean, if you grow up in our generation, Roy Rogers and Trigger, that was talking about legends. So then we go up in the stands and in the middle of the show, Rafael Mendez says, I'd like to the solo trumpet piece, whatever he was going to do. He says, I'd like to dedicate it to my buddy Pete Barbutti, another great trumpet player in the stands. And everybody applauded. And I said, did you hear that? And the kid said to me, yeah, Dad, but we rode Trigger. And so I thought, yeah, everything is relative, isn't it?
They have their priorities.
Yeah, everything is relative.
I'm glad you brought it up because I was going to ask, what did your children think of what their dad did?
Well, I'm not sure they knew all the time. And it's funny that the older two kids were very shy, retiring. The younger two were very outgoing. So when they'd meet people, they would, say, oh, it's nice to meet you and everything. The other ones were shy to meet people. But I took, when my youngest son, Mark, when he was maybe 6 or something, his entire world became the Empire State Building. The Empire State Building became the symbol of strength, height, sophistication. It became everything. When you say that's a nice car, yeah, but it's not as nice as the Empire State Building. That maybe it was the rhythm of the word, that whatever it was. And so I was going back to do some shows. I was going to do the Arthur Godfrey radio show, CBS in New York. I was going to do Merv Griffin, and then Mike Douglas down in Philly. So I took him with me, and we went to the Empire State Building. And we went on, and he said, "Oh, this is like the," and I took him to the Godfrey show. Then we did Merv Griffin show. Then we went down to Philly to do Mike Douglas. And at rehearsal, there's a group called the Little Angels of Korea. They were Korean children, and they sang American songs phonetically. They didn't speak in English, but they sang the songs. And they played drums and things, and they were beautiful to watch, and they were really good singers. And so they were singing, and then they were speaking in Korean, and a foreign language to a kid who's never heard a foreign language before is something. He said, "What's that sound they're making?" I said, "Well, they're speaking." He said, "That's not speaking." I said, "Yes, they're from Korea, another country. That's the way they talk over there." So how do they understand that? Well, because that's the way they talk. It's something that we say easily, but to a child, went through this whole thing, and I summarized the whole thing by saying, "You see, they don't speak English, so they don't know what we're saying, and we don't speak Korean, so we don't know what they're saying, but yet we can still all get along." He says, "Oh." So when the rehearsal was over, they walked up the aisle and they passed by us, and the one little girl, obviously bilingual, she said, "You're a nice looking boy. What's your name?" He said, "My name is Mark." She said, "Well, that's a nice name." He said, "Thank you." She walked by. He turned to me. He said, "I thought you said I didn't speak Korean." It took me the rest of his life to put that into perspective. He went and told his teacher in school that he speaks Korean. I mean, there was no erasing the lesson.
That's amazing. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I want to congratulate you on like creating your own niche. It seems like.
Yeah, I think sometimes, Monk, I think sometimes only musicians or people who grew up in that big band era who were close to that, maybe they're the only ones who know what the hell I'm talking about sometimes. But uh, yeah, I still do things, anti-country music,
Mm,
but with a tongue-in-cheek thing,
yeah. Was
Uh,
there a camaraderie that occurred because of the road travails, the life on the road?
yeah, it's not easy, I'll tell you. I mean, it sounds great to be in a new town every 2 weeks and have a new band and everything, but uh, first of all, there's the getting there, and in the beginning, flying was really special. Very few people flew. There were prop engines, internal combustion engines. They weren't jets. And then jets came in right about the time when I started to travel. And but you go to the airport and you travel here, you travel there, but then you get to the town, you got to get to the hotel, and they usually have the entertainers. The club owners say you usually stay at this hotel or that. So you get to the hotel, and the same thing. Since I was living in Vegas, where everything is open, it's still hard to get to a hotel where everything closed. Uh, Breakfast was finished at 10. If you ordered eggs past 10 o'clock, the chef came out of the kitchen with a cleaver. That was a cardinal sin. Uh, and out here in Vegas, you order breakfast at 4 in the morning, you order breakfast at 2 in the afternoon, because there's no clock. Everything is going. Bars are 24 hours, everything. And so then you get finished, and when you're finished, there was nowhere to go. Everything was closed. The only place to get something to eat when you got finished with the gig was maybe the Greyhound bus station, if they had a lunch counter. You can imagine what that was like. So that's why when I first came out here in 1960, we worked with the Millionaires. We worked a gig at South Bend, Indiana, and we had our clothes packed, and we did Auld Lang Syne, and we went out the back door, broke down, put the stuff in, and we left. And January the 2nd, I guess it was, we never stopped. We drove straight through. We got to Vegas, and I was here for a little while. And I called my wife and said, "You got to get out here. This is, I mean, everything is open 24 hours. The only thing couldn't open were federal things like the banks or the courthouse or something. But every hotel had the cashier. So if you needed money and you were working there, you just go up and say, 'Give me a draw slip,' and you'd sign it. You'd get $100, and then you'd pay them back at the end of the week. So and they could cash checks for you. And the bars are open 20. Not that any of us were drinkers, but they're open 24/7. Restaurants are open 20. You could buy a pair of shoes at 4 in the morning, and it was like a miracle. The food markets were open 24/7.
Oh, you found Shangri-La.
Yeah, and for a person who was, spent it, when we get finished and when we first start traveling, there was no TV. And so there was a TV, but hotels didn't have them, only just a few private homes. And so there was the radio. And the only thing on late at night was WWVA Wheeling, West Virginia, which was all country. So you listen to the radio and you'd read a book or read the paper. And,
Yeah, there's a lot of hours to pass.
oh, man.
Maybe some of your routines came out of that downtime.
I think a lot of them did, because I've never been able to write. Oddly enough, now I could write for TV, for sketches, because I did a series in Toronto called Pete's Place. It took place in Vegas, but we shot it in Toronto. And the deal was that I had a small club off the strip in Vegas, and everything went wrong that could go wrong with the club. The mob tried to move in and this and that. And so I asked a bunch of my friends to come up, and I put people together who've never been together before to see if the sparks would fly, and it really worked beautifully. Like Phyllis Diller and Irwin Corey, Dick Shawn and Pat McCormick, the guy who wrote the Tonight Show. I put all these crazy people together, and it worked great. They had fun, and they got along great. But yeah, I enjoyed that series. It was fun to do. And the opening was cute too. It showed a Rolls Royce going down the strip in Vegas at night with the marquees, Frank Sinatra, Wayne Newton, Elvis Presley. And then the Rolls Royce stops at a red light, and the camera pans back. It shows the driver up front with his proper dress. And I'm sitting in the back of the Rolls Royce with a big cigar, in my tuxedo. And then the light turns green and the Rolls pulls away, and I'm on a bicycle next to it. And I have my trumpet hanging on the handlebars. So I walked up to this club, and it's the same Roman printing that's on Caesar's Palace. It said Pete's Place. And I look up, and the L falls out, and then it just, or it says Pete's Palace, and the L falls out. It just says Pete's Place.
Nice. Some good
Yeah,
shtick.
so it was great. Yeah.
Well,
But
thank you for your time.
I could write those routines for these people, because I'd write frameworks, because all these people were great, and I'd say, I'm not going to tell you what to say. I'm going to do this, Maury Amsterdam, and, like they know a million jokes. I'm not going to tell you what, here's the framework. We do this. And from here, you go outside. Just remember the ending is when I drop the glass on the floor and you say this, and then we go to commercials. And it worked great. We did 50 shows, and they were good.
Do you ever get residuals or anything like that?
You know what? Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah.
And I have, in fact, I have one at my door here that I keep. I think it's from, I don't know where it is now, but I think it's from some show that had a lot of girls on it, the Golden Girls or something like that. Or no, it wasn't that sitcom. This was a show. I forget. Anyway,
Gold Diggers.
Gold Diggers. Yeah, there's some kind of show like that, and I got a residual for 2 cents. So I kept the check. I didn't cash the check.
Well, good.
Yeah.
If retirement is in your future, then you're all set.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and you've been generous with it. And I wish you the best in your upcoming gigs, and may the New Year's Eve horns be scarce.
Yeah, amen, amen. They'll still be there, though. I used to call it amateur drunk night.
Yeah.
People who, I've never really drank more than
Right.
one glass of wine. Now it's obligatory to get
Yeah.
as foolish as you can be.
Yeah, they didn't know how to be drunks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pause here and we'll say our goodbyes.
Okay, Monk.
All right.